My daughter was fighting for her life in the ICU when my dad called. My name is Xavier. I'm 36. And for the last decade, I've been the backbone of my family's artisan coffee roasting business in Portland. I'm the one who balances the books, fixes the machines, and keeps the lights on while everyone else plays at being entrepreneurs. But 2 nights ago, my world narrowed down to the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of a ventilator. My 7-year-old daughter, Diana, was struggling against a sudden, violent respiratory collapse that turned her fingernails blue in minutes. I was leaning against the cold glass of the isolation room, watching her small chest labor for every cubic centimeter of oxygen, when my phone vibrated. It was Dad. Tomorrow's Grant's 27th birthday, he said, skipping any hello or inquiry about his granddaughter. I need you at the shop by 6 a.m. to prep the catering and set up the new roasting display. Grant wants everything perfect for his investors. Don't be late, Xavier. Dad. I can't, I whispered, my voice sounding like gravel. Diana's lungs aren't responding. She's fighting for her life right now. I'm not leaving this hospital. I heard that heavy, annoyed, huffed the sound of a man who views empathy as a weakness. Stop being so dramatic, Xavier. She's a kid, she'll bounce back. You're just using this as an excuse because you're jealous of the attention your brother is getting. If you aren't there to support this family tomorrow, then you're officially cut off. Don't expect a dime or a word from us ever again. I looked at the monitor, then at the name Dad on the screen. Fine, I said, my heart turning to stone. Consider me gone. I hung up and blocked his number. The next morning, Diana's eyelashes finally fluttered. She opened her eyes, looked at me through the oxygen mask, and whispered something about my father that changed the trajectory of my life forever. Before I reveal the shocking truth my daughter told me and how I finally dismantled my family's entitlement, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. Your support helps me share these powerful stories of standing up for what's right. The smell of burnt espresso beans always reminds me of the day I realized my family viewed my bank account as a shared resource. For the past decade, I have been the invisible architect of Portland's most successful boutique roastery, a business that technically bears my father's name but survives solely on my labor and credit score. I started this venture when I was 26, pouring my meager life savings into a dilapidated warehouse and a vintage German roaster that I spent 6 months restoring with my own hands. My father, Mr. Douglas, provided the initial lease signature, and in his mind, that single act of clerical assistance granted him eternal ownership over my future earnings. He frequently reminded me that a son's first duty is to the patriarch, a philosophy that conveniently ignored the fact that I was the only one actually working 12-hour shifts. My younger brother, Grant, is the primary beneficiary of this lopsided arrangement. At 27, his resume is a graveyard of failed startups and half-baked ideas, all funded by the family pot that I consistently replenish. 2 years ago, Grant decided he was a visionary tech entrepreneur and convinced our father that he needed a $40,000 loan for a mobile app that never made it past the home screen. When the creditors started calling, my father didn't look at Grant. He looked at me. He told me that as the eldest, it was my moral obligation to protect my brother's reputation. I ended up co-signing a consolidation loan that added $500 to my monthly expenses, money that should have been going into my daughter's college fund. It wasn't just the big loans, it was the persistent, corrosive entitlement that bled into every weekend. My wife, Naomi, often pointed out the absurdity of our situation during our quiet dinners. She watched as I spent my Sunday mornings fixing the plumbing at my father's house because he refused to pay a professional, or how I would receive frantic texts from Grant asking for $300 because he had accidentally overspent at a nightclub in downtown Portland. My father always framed these requests as tests of loyalty. He would say that family isn't about counting pennies, yet he was the first to count every hour I spent away from the shop focusing on my own wife and child. The logic of our household was dictated by my father's performative exhaustion. He would sit in the shop's office, nursing a latte I had brewed, and complain about the weight of the world while I hauled 60-kilo sacks of green beans onto the loading dock. He treated Grant like a delicate prodigy, whose spirit would be crushed by the indignity of manual labor. Consequently, I became the default problem solver. When Grant totaled his second car because he was texting while driving, my father insisted I hand over my spare vehicle so Grant wouldn't lose his social momentum. I was told that being a man meant carrying the burdens of those who were too weak to carry their own. The financial abuse reached a fever pitch last summer. I discovered that my father had been skimming nearly 15% off our wholesale contracts to fund Grant's lifestyle. When I confronted them in the roasting room, Grant just smirked and adjusted his expensive headphones, while my father shouted that I was being ungrateful for the roof over my head. He conveniently forgot that I paid the mortgage on that roof. I stayed because I believed that if I worked hard enough, I could eventually earn their respect. I was a fool who mistook being exploited for being essential. I built a cage out of high-quality coffee beans and walked right into it, locking the door behind me while my father held the key and my brother held the bill. The fluorescent hum of the intensive care unit is a sound that hollows out your soul. 2 nights ago, the air in our small suburban home in Portland shattered when my daughter, Diana, suddenly stopped being able to draw a full breath. Her face turned a terrifying shade of gray, and her tiny hands clawed at her throat as if trying to tear open a path for the oxygen that refused to come. My wife, Naomi, didn't even have time to put on shoes. She grabbed the car keys while I scooped our daughter's limp body into my arms, feeling her heart racing like a trapped bird against my chest. We drove through red lights with our hazards blinking, praying that the world would move out of our way before her heart gave out from the strain of suffocation. Once we reached the emergency room, a team of nurses and doctors swept her away behind heavy swinging doors, leaving Naomi and me standing in a hallway that smelled of industrial bleach and desperation. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold my phone, but I knew I had to call my father. I thought that in a moment of life and death, the petty grievances of business and my brother's failures would finally vanish. I called Mr. Douglas 3 times before he picked up on the 4th attempt. I could hear the clinking of glasses and the upbeat rhythm of a jazz playlist in the background, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence of the waiting room. "Dad, it's Diana," I choked out, leaning my forehead against the cold brick wall. "She's in the ER. They've moved her to the ICU. She can't breathe on her own, Dad. We need you here." There was a long, agonizing pause, followed by the muffled sound of him muffled the receiver to speak to someone else. When he came back, his voice was tight with irritation. "Xavier, we are right in the middle of a tasting session for the birthday bourbon. Grant spent weeks sourcing these bottles for his celebration tomorrow. You know how important this weekend is for his networking. Is it really that bad? Or are you just overreacting because you're tired? The doctors are there, right? What exactly do you expect me to do from a waiting room?" The cruelty of his question felt like a physical blow to my stomach. I looked at Naomi, who was huddled in a plastic chair, her eyes wide with a terror that I couldn't soothe. I tried to explain that our daughter was being intubated, that the doctors were using words like critical and unstable, but my father just sighed. He told me to keep him updated via text, but requested that I didn't call again tonight because they didn't want to bring down the mood of the gathering. He hung up before I could even tell him which hospital we were at. An hour later, I saw a notification on my social media feed that I should have ignored. Grant had posted a photo of a $300 bottle of vintage rye, captioned with "Pre-birthday vibes with the best crew. Family first." My father was in the background, smiling and holding a cigar, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him during a work week. They weren't just absent, they were celebrating while my daughter was being kept alive by a machine. Naomi caught a glimpse of the screen and let out a broken, jagged sob that echoed through the empty corridor. In that moment, the last thread of loyalty I held for the man who raised me snapped with a finality that was almost audible. The night stretched into a blur of vitals, monitors, and the soft footsteps of specialists. Every time a doctor approached us, my heart stopped, waiting for the news that would end my world. Not once did my phone light up with a message from my brother asking if his niece was okay. Not once did my mother call to ask if we needed a blanket or a cup of coffee. We were alone in the trenches of the most terrifying night of our lives, while the people who shared my DNA were busy icing a cake and chilling champagne for a man-child who had never known a day of true struggle. The elevator doors slid open with a sharp, metallic chime that sounded like an alarm bell in the heavy stillness of the morning. I was nursing a lukewarm cup of vending machine coffee, my eyes burning from 48 hours of sleeplessness when I saw my father, Mr. Douglas, striding toward the ICU waiting area. He wasn't wearing the face of a grieving grandfather. He was wearing his expensive wool overcoat and a look of practiced, impatient authority. He didn't even look toward the window where Diana lay, surrounded by monitors and IV drips. Instead, he marched straight to where I was sitting and stood over me, his shadow blotting out the pale sunlight streaming through the corridor windows. "You're making a scene by being here, Xavier," he began, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register he used when he wanted to intimidate me. "The staff at the roastery are asking why the lead roaster is missing on the biggest delivery day of the month. You've let your personal anxieties interfere with our professional reputation, and I won't have it." I looked up at him, stunned by the sheer lack of humanity in his eyes. "Dad, my daughter is in a medically induced coma. The doctors don't know if she'll be able to breathe on her own by tonight. How can you even talk about the shop right now?" He waved a hand dismissively, as if my child's life was a minor scheduling conflict. "She's stable, isn't she? The machines are doing the work. Now, listen carefully. Grant found a vintage Probat roaster in Seattle for $15,000. It's a steal, but the seller needs a deposit by noon today to hold it. Grant's personal credit line is tapped out because of that logistics project last spring, and I need you to authorize a transfer from the business's emergency reserve account immediately." I felt a cold, sharp laughter bubble up in my chest, the kind that only comes when you've reached the absolute limit of what you can endure. An emergency reserve? Dad, that money is for things like a roof collapsing or a global pandemic. Not for a new toy for a brother who hasn't roasted a single bean in 3 years. My wife, Naomi, and I are facing medical bills that could bankrupt us, and you want me to fund Grant's newest hobby? My father's face turned a mottled shade of purple. He took a step closer, invading my personal space until I could smell the expensive cologne he'd applied before coming to this house of pain. "Don't you dare talk to me about money, Xavier. Everything you have, I built for you. That account exists because I allowed you to manage my legacy. Grant needs this win. He needs to feel like a success on his birthday, and you're standing in the way because of a grudge. Give me the authorization code. Now." "No," I said, the word feeling heavier and more solid than anything I'd ever spoken. "I am using my power of attorney to freeze the business accounts for the next 48 hours until I can properly assess our family's financial survival. Not a cent goes to Grant. Not today. Not ever again." The air in the hallway seemed to vanish. My father's jaw twitched, and before I could react, he swung his hand in a wide, violent arc. The crack of his palm against my cheek echoed off the linoleum floors, a sound so loud it brought a nurse running from the station. My head snapped to the side, my skin stinging with the sudden heat of the blow, but I didn't move. I didn't even raise my hand to my face. I simply turned back to him, my eyes fixed on his with a terrifying clarity. "Get out," I whispered, my voice devoid of any emotion. "If you take one more step toward me or my daughter's room, I will have security remove you, and I will file a restraining order before the sun sets. You are no longer a grandfather. You are just a stranger who has overstayed his welcome." He looked at me with a mixture of shock and pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't offer a word of apology. He simply straightened his coat, muttered that I would regret this betrayal, and walked back toward the elevators. As the doors closed on him, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The man who had hit me was a ghost. The man standing in the ICU was a father who finally knew exactly what he had to do to protect his own. The stinging heat on my cheek had faded into a dull, throbbing numbness by the time I opened my laptop in the corner of the hospital cafeteria. I wasn't just a grieving father anymore. I was a man who had finally seen the blueprint of his own destruction. The slap from Mr. Douglas hadn't broken my spirit. It had acted like a physical reset button, clearing away 36 years of misplaced guilt. As I logged into the primary business portal for our Portland roastery, my hands were surprisingly steady. I knew exactly what I had to do to ensure that Diana and Naomi would never have to beg for a cent from the men who viewed our suffering as an inconvenience. First, I navigated to the user management settings of our commercial banking suite. With 4 deliberate clicks, I revoked the administrative access for both my father and Grant. For years, I had allowed them to maintain view-only status, which they had somehow bypassed using my saved credentials on the office computer to authorize small recurring transfers. No more. I changed the 2-factor authentication to my personal mobile device and updated the security questions to things they could never guess, details about the first drawing Diana ever made for me. I watched the confirmation green check marks appear on the screen like small victories in a war I should have started a decade ago. Next, I turned my attention to the corporate credit lines. I called our account manager at the bank, a woman named Mrs. Gable who had handled our finances since the shop opened. I need to report a potential internal compromise, I told her, my voice echoing in the quiet cafeteria. I want to place an immediate freeze on all secondary cards associated with the business EIN. Yes, including the ones issued to Douglas and Grant. I also need a full audit trail of every transaction over $500 from the last 6 months. I knew this would cause a catastrophic failure in their daily lives. Within hours, the gas cards wouldn't work, the lunch meetings would be declined, and Grant's pre-ordered birthday gifts would be stuck in digital limbo. My next call was to a local attorney, Mr. Henderson, who specialized in small business litigation and family trusts. We had met at a Chamber of Commerce event years ago, and he had always hinted that my business structure was dangerously intertwined with my personal assets. I need to sever a partnership, David, I said, leaning back into the hard plastic chair. And I suspect there's been significant embezzlement of company funds by a minority stakeholder. I have the digital logs ready to be sent to your firm. We spent the next 40 minutes discussing the mechanics of a forced buyout and the filing of a forensic accounting report. If Grant had been skimming money to fund his lifestyle, as I suspected, this wasn't just a family dispute anymore, it was a felony. By the time I finished, the sun was beginning to dip below the Portland skyline, casting long, orange shadows across the hospital parking lot. I felt a strange sense of professional detachment, as if I were auditing a failing company rather than dismantling my own family's livelihood. I realized that the emergency reserve my father had been so desperate to pillage was nearly $60,000, money I had painstakingly saved by skipping my own bonuses and working every holiday. That money belonged to Diana's recovery now. It would pay for the best specialists, the long-term physical therapy, and the quiet home we would need once she was finally discharged from this place. I sent one final email to my father's personal account, copied to his lawyer. It was a formal notice of my resignation as the managing director, effective immediately, along with a cease and desist order regarding any further contact with me or my medical team. I didn't use emotional language. I didn't mention the slap or the birthday party. I spoke in the only language he had ever truly respected, the language of ownership and liability. I closed my laptop with a quiet click, the sound of a prison door locking from the outside. I was finally on the other side of the bars, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. The silence of a hospital room is usually heavy, but by the following afternoon, my phone began to vibrate with a frequency that felt like a physical assault. I was sitting by Diana's bed, watching the slow, rhythmic sweep of the heart monitor, when the first wave of frantic messages from Grant hit the screen. It seemed the birthday celebration of the century had run into a catastrophic technical difficulty at a high-end steakhouse in downtown Portland. My brother's entitlement was a fragile thing, and it was currently shattering in front of his wealthy investor friends as the waiter handed back his corporate gold card for the third time. "Xavier, what the hell did you do?" the first text read, followed by a string of expletives that would have made a sailor blush. My card just declined for a $2,000 dinner tab. "I'm standing here like an idiot while the manager threatens to call the police. Unlock the account right now, or I'm coming down there to finish what Dad started." I didn't reply. I simply took a screenshot for my attorney, Mr. Henderson, and muted the notification. 10 minutes later, a series of alerts from our business security system informed me that someone was repeatedly attempting to log into the roastery's payroll portal from my father's home IP address. Each failed attempt was a small, satisfying click of a trap, shutting tight. Then came the call from my mother, Mrs. Martha, who usually stayed on the sidelines until things affected her own comfort. Her voice was a practiced tremor of disappointment and grief. "Xavier, how could you be so cruel on your brother's special day? Your father is in a state of collapse. He had to use his personal emergency savings to cover the restaurant bill, and now he's discovered that the mortgage payment for the shop has been reversed. Do you want us to lose everything? Do you want your own parents out on the street while you sit in a fancy hospital room playing God with our lives?" "Mom," I said, my voice as cold as the sterile water in the pitcher beside me, "I am sitting in an ICU because my daughter almost died. I'm not playing God. I'm simply no longer playing the role of the family ATM. If Dad has to use his savings, then perhaps he'll finally understand the value of the money I've been earning for him. And as for Grant, he's 27. It's time he learned that a gold card is a privilege, not a birthright. You've become a monster, Xavier, she hissed, her facade of motherly concern evaporating instantly. That textbook education has turned your heart to stone. We raised you, we fed you, and this is how you repay us? By humiliating your father in front of his peers? By ruining Grant's future? You're a selfish, ungrateful child, and God will judge you for what you're doing to this family. I hung up before she could start the next verse of her scripted guilt trip. I realized then that they didn't want a son. They wanted a silent, obedient engine that produced capital. The final blow to their facade came an hour later in the form of a frantic voicemail from our cousin Caleb, who worked as a junior associate at a local credit union. He sounded terrified. Xavier, I don't know what's going on, but 2 guys in suits just showed up at the roastery asking for Grant. They said they were from a private collection agency regarding a high-interest bridge loan he took out 6 months ago, using the shop's equipment as collateral. They have a repossession order. Xavier. If someone doesn't pay the arrears by 5 p.m., they're bringing a truck to haul away the roasting drums. Dad is screaming at them, and Grant has locked himself in the bathroom. I listened to the message twice, feeling a strange sense of relief. The house of cards wasn't just falling, it was imploding. Grant hadn't just been skimming, he had been gambling with the very tools of my trade. If I hadn't frozen the accounts and involved a forensic accountant, I would have walked back into a business that was nothing but an empty shell. I forwarded Caleb's message to my lawyer and the bank's fraud department. My family had spent years telling me that I was dramatic for worrying about our finances. Now, they were finally meeting the reality I had been shielding them from for a decade. The party was over, and the lights were finally turning on. The first light of dawn over the Portland skyline brought a clarity that no amount of coffee or legal advice could provide. I was holding Diana's hand, watching the way her small finger seemed almost translucent against the white hospital sheets, when I felt a faint, delicate squeeze. Her eyelashes fluttered, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, her eyes met mine without the fog of sedation. My heart performed a jagged dance in my chest as I leaned in, my breath hitching as she tried to form words through the dry, papery texture of her throat. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound in the hum of the monitors. I felt a tear slide down my face, a release of pressure I hadn't realized was suffocating me. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here. You're safe." She blinked slowly, as if processing the sterile surroundings, and then a look of profound, adult-like sadness crossed her face. She looked toward the door of the ICU room as if she expected someone to be standing there, someone she was afraid to see. "Is Grandpa coming back?" she asked, her lip trembling. I shook my head, my hand tightening around hers. "No, Diana, he's not coming here anymore. Why do you ask?" What she told me next made the blood in my veins turn to liquid nitrogen. She began to recount a Saturday afternoon a month ago, a day I had spent 12 hours roasting a special batch of Ethiopian beans for the shop while she stayed at my father's house. She told me how Grant had taken her ceramic piggy bank, the one shaped like a galaxy that I'd bought her for her birthday, and smashed it on the garage floor to take the $60 she had saved from her allowance. "I started to cry, Dad," Diana whispered, her voice cracking with the memory of the betrayal. But Mr. Douglas came in and gripped my shoulder so hard it bruised. He told me that family doesn't tattle on family. He said if I told you, I would be the reason the roastery went out of business, and that you'd have to work even harder and never come home to play with me again. He made me promise to tell you I lost the money at the park. I sat there in the pale morning light, feeling a wave of nausea so powerful I had to grip the edge of the bed to stay upright. My father hadn't just exploited me. He had systematically terrorized my 7-year-old daughter to protect the reputation of his favorite son. He had used her love for me as a weapon against her, forcing her to carry a burden of guilt and fear that no child should ever know. The grandpa I had been trying to respect was a monster who traded his granddaughter's sense of safety for a few bucks to fund Grant's habits. "Dad," Diana said, pulling me back from the dark void of my thoughts. "Can we go somewhere else? Somewhere where the phone doesn't ring all the time and Grandpa can't find us? I don't want to be the reason you're sad anymore." Her request wasn't an outburst of anger, it was a plea for survival. She was asking for the one thing I had been too cowardly to give her, a life free from the toxic rot of my biological family. I leaned down and kissed her forehead, the smell of hospital soap and strawberry shampoo filling my senses. "We're going, Diana. I promised her, my voice vibrating with a resolve that felt like iron. As soon as the doctors say you're strong enough, we're leaving Portland. We're going to find a place with big trees and no ghosts. I'm never letting them touch our lives again. In that quiet moment, the man I used to be the one who hoped for an apology died. I didn't need a confession from my father anymore. I had the only truth that mattered, and it was written in the tear-stained eyes of my daughter. The rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Mr. Henderson's law office, a relentless, gray drumming that felt like the final countdown to a long-overdue execution. Inside the mahogany-paneled room, the air was thick with the scent of expensive stationery and the acrid desperation of two men who had finally run out of people to manipulate. My father, Mr. Douglas, sat across from me with his shoulders slumped, his signature wool coat looking wrinkled and cheap in the harsh fluorescent light. Beside him, Grant was a jittery mess, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit that didn't involve taking responsibility for his own life. "Xavier, let's be reasonable," my father began, his voice lacking its usual booming authority. "The bank has started the foreclosure process on the roastery. Grant's creditors are threatening to sue the estate. We're family, son. You can't just stand by and watch us lose the house and the business over a few missed payments and a misunderstanding at the hospital." I didn't say a word. I simply slid a manila folder across the polished table toward them. Inside were the forensic audit logs showing $15,000 in unauthorized transfers, the police report regarding Grant's identity theft, and most importantly, the signed affidavit from the hospital staff detailing my daughter's trauma. Grant's face turned a sickly shade of white as he glanced at the documents. He tried to speak, but only a dry, wheezing sound came out of his throat. "This isn't a negotiation," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a surgical blade. "I have already signed over my minority shares to the bank in exchange for them releasing me from the co-signed loans. The roastery is no longer my problem, and neither are your debts. As of 10 o'clock this morning, the sheriff has been served with a temporary restraining order. If either of you comes within 500 feet of Naomi, Diana, or me, you will be arrested immediately." My father let out a broken, jagged sound. Half sob, half growl. "You'd send your own brother to prison? You'd let your father rot in a rental apartment for the sake of a few dollars?" "I'm not sending you anywhere," I replied, standing up and buttoning my coat with calm, deliberate movements. "Your own choices did that. I'm simply no longer the person who pays the bill for your cruelty. You traded your granddaughter's safety for a birthday party, Dad. That was the day you ceased to exist in my world." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the echoes of my father's hollow threats behind me. As I stepped into the elevator, I felt a profound, chilling sense of peace. The ghost of the man I used to be was finally buried under a mountain of legal paperwork, and for the first time, I was breathing clean air. The heavy, metallic thud of the moving truck's door closing was the final punctuation mark on my life in Portland. As I drove our SUV across the state line into the rugged, open beauty of Montana, I watched the rearview mirror until the city's skyline was swallowed by the horizon. Beside me, Naomi was finally sleeping without her jaw clenched in stress, and in the back seat, Diana was humming a quiet tune while drawing a mountain range on her tablet. We weren't just moving, we were escaping a burning building that I had spent 36 years trying to extinguish with my own blood. The aftermath in Portland was a slow, public implosion for the men who shared my DNA. Because I had withdrawn my financial life support, the house of cards collapsed with terrifying speed. Mr. Douglas lost the roastery to the bank within 90 days. The property was sold at a sheriff's auction to a national coffee conglomerate that didn't care about his legacy. Without my credit score to lean on, he was forced into a cramped one-bedroom rental apartment in a part of town he used to look down upon. For the first time in his life, he had to learn the humiliating reality of a fixed budget and a utility bill he couldn't deflect onto a son. Grant's fate was even more stark. The forensic audit I provided to the authorities led to a formal investigation into his fraudulent loan applications. While he managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence through a plea bargain, he was left with a felony record for financial fraud and a mountain of restitution debt that would follow him for decades. I heard through a distant cousin that he was now working 12-hour shifts at a commercial laundry facility, the kind of grueling manual labor he had spent his entire life mocking me for doing. He was finally learning that a visionary without a wallet to steal from is just another man with a broken ego. We settled in a small town near Missoula, where the air smelled of pine needles and damp earth instead of burnt espresso and resentment. I took a job managing a local engineering firm's logistics, a role that paid less but allowed me to be home for dinner every single night. We didn't tell my parents our new address. I changed my phone number, deleted my social media, and instructed our lawyer to handle any further communication regarding the final liquidation of our old assets. The silence was not a void, it was a sanctuary. One evening, as we sat on our new porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of violet and gold, Diana leaned against my shoulder. She wasn't the terrified child from the ICU anymore. She was a girl who knew her father was a fortress. I realized then that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's a leak that eventually drowns everyone involved. I had stopped being a bank, a buffer, and a victim. I was finally just a father, a husband, and a man who had learned that saying no was the most sacred thing I could ever do for the people I truly loved. The cycle was broken, and for the first time, I was finally free.